Story 1. This past Monday, my co-workers and I returned to our hotel after a long day working out in the field. Rebecca and I walked together to our rooms. As we stood outside, I unlocked mine, pushed the door open, and froze. There was someone in the bathroom. At first, I thought it must be a cleaning lady who had accidentally walked in or stayed behind. But something felt off. I called out, "Hello?" There was no answer. Then I noticed. She had my bag. My clothes were in her hands. Stunned, I turned to my co-worker and said, "There's a woman in my room." I turned back and asked the woman, "What are you doing with my stuff?" Things get fuzzy here. I was in shock, and I can't remember exactly what I said or what she mumbled in return, but she kept saying something about how her key still worked, how it was still working, and that's how she got in. It was clear she hadn't expected anyone to return so soon. She dropped my bag and started fumbling through her purse and a white plastic bag. By now, my co-worker was behind me, witnessing the chaos unfold. The woman was panicking, trying to walk past me to the door. I stopped her and asked, "What's in the bag?" thinking it might be my stuff. No, it's just my things," she replied quickly. "I'll show you." She opened it and I checked. Nothing of mine was inside. Somehow, stupidly, I let her leave. I walked into my room. It had been ransacked. I did a quick inventory. Electronics? Still there. But when I looked in the bathroom, I found my underwear, my bikini, even my clothes and passport shoved into bags. Bags that weren't mine. My own items had been repacked, mixed together and handled. Then I noticed my medication. The pill bottles had been opened. She had gone through everything. Panic set in. I ran out of the room, hoping to find her before she disappeared. I checked the laundry room, the sides of the hotel, but she was gone. Defeated, my co-worker and I went to the lobby to report the break-in. We then called the police. Back in the room, I noticed something I hadn't before. A metal bat on my bed, a little larger than those novelty bats you get at baseball games. It even had a flashlight at one end. She must have left it behind when she bolted. There was also a necklace, something that must have fallen out of her bag in the scramble. That scared me the most. If she was carrying a bat, what had she been planning? The police arrived and took our statements. They looked around but couldn't find any signs of forced entry. Nothing broken, no scratches or pry marks on the door or windows. That's when we all leaned toward the theory that she might have had a spare key. The front desk, however, swore up and down that it wasn't possible. Still, the police weren't satisfied. The officer called for backup, bringing in 2 more officers to help search the area. After a while, they left. There wasn't much more they could do. I finally sat down, trying to calm my nerves. I made some calls, but something kept bothering me. The drywall. There were bits of it in the sink and none of us could figure out where it came from. As I sat there, staring at the bathroom mirror above the sink, it hit me. I grabbed my co-worker and asked her to help me remove the mirror. We carefully pulled it off the wall, and behind it was a hole. A hole just big enough for someone to squeeze through. I stood there frozen. There was a hidden space behind the mirror. We called the police again. My boss pointed out there were still 2 officers parked outside, so I ran down and told them what we found. One of them, the female cop, rolled her eyes, but the younger officer agreed to come back up with me. They removed more of the wall and looked inside. What they found left everyone speechless. Pillows, blankets, cigarettes, clothes, toothbrushes. The woman had been living behind my mirror. She had access to me and my room at any time. The young officer called the original cop back. I heard him say over the radio, "No way." He came back to take photos. He was just as stunned as we were. We packed up and left immediately. Later I realized she had probably been there for a long time. The last time we stayed at this hotel, I remembered randomly smelling cigarette smoke. I'd assumed someone in a nearby room was smoking in their bathroom and that the smell was traveling through the vents. But no, it was coming from the other side of the mirror. She had access to more than just my room, too. The drywall holes were left over from renovations. Instead of fixing them, the hotel just covered them with mirrors. She could have been going into other people's rooms while they were gone, moving around behind the walls. It was beyond disturbing. I keep thinking about what could have happened if I had come back to my room just a few minutes later. Would she still have been in the wall? Watching me? Waiting? Or worse? I don't think I'll ever sleep in a hotel the same way again. A story 2. I'm 18 and female. I just started a job at a hotel a little over a month ago as a housekeeper. The hotel is located in a very rural part of the Midwest. Not a super busy place, except for the occasional family reunions checking in or a few workers passing through the state. Many of the people who come through are older, 40s, 50s and up. When I first started, my parents warned me to be careful. They said the hotel seemed sketchy. But honestly, I never really found it to be sketchy, or the people for that matter. Until one day, about 2 weeks ago, I had just clocked in around 10:30 a.m. and headed down to the end of the hall, opposite where the lobby is, so I could start on my stayovers. Those are rooms where people stay more than one night. At the end of that hall, there are 4 rooms, tucked into what I'd describe as almost a corner. You can't really see the doors to those rooms until you reach the end of the hallway. 2 rooms on one side, 2 on the other. I was grabbing the supplies I needed when a man came out of one of those rooms and asked me how to work the coffee machine. He was a stayover guest. He was about 3 times my size, 6'3", maybe 300 pounds. I'm 5'3", about 125, but it didn't seem weird at first. I'm friendly and outgoing, and I figured it was just small talk. I showed him how to work it and went back to cleaning the other room, minding my own business. A few minutes later, he came out again. This time, he said his room didn't need to be cleaned, which I was fine with. That's one less room on my list. My manager had come down the hall to help strip a room that had checked out, so I turned to go strip another room when the man came out again. I figured he had another question, so I turned around to speak to him. He looked at me and asked, "Aren't you scared to do your job?" I replied, "No, not really," explaining that I rarely have any interactions with guests as a housekeeper. That's when things turned. He said I was awfully pretty and that I should carry mace or a weapon to protect myself. I showed him the car keys I kept in my pocket, the kind with a sharp edge, for that exact reason. I smiled, trying to brush it off, but I started feeling anxious. He leaned in slightly and said, "I don't think car keys are enough. You're small, you could easily get snatched up." It was like my body just locked up, my stomach dropped. That wave of fear you don't see coming hit me all at once. I quickly made an excuse and went into the room across the hall where my manager was. I waited until I was sure he had gone back into his room before I continued my job as normally as possible. The truth is, I was shaken. I sat in one of the other rooms down the hall for almost an hour, crying, having an anxiety attack. All I could think about was that man. His size, his words, how he kept coming back. I genuinely thought he might try to find me again, maybe follow me into another room and kidnap me. I kept replaying it in my head. Every time I heard a door creak open or a footstep in the hallway, my heart jumped into my throat. The worst part was how calculated he seemed. He didn't say anything explicitly threatening, nothing you could call the police over, but everything about the way he said it, the way he looked at me, it all screamed danger. I kept thinking, what if my manager hadn't been nearby? What if I'd been alone in one of those rooms at the end of the hall where no one could hear me scream? It didn't help that the hallway itself was isolated from the lobby and any main exits. Those rooms were tucked away in a little corner, practically invisible unless you walked all the way down. I thought about how easy it would have been for him to do something and disappear before anyone even noticed I was gone. Eventually I pulled myself together and finished the day, but I told my manager what had happened. She listened, but there wasn't much that could be done. He hadn't touched me or threatened me, he hadn't broken any rules, just a guest who made uncomfortable comments. But that was enough for me. Since then, I've been much more cautious. I avoid being alone in the far extend rooms. If a guest comes out more than once to talk, I walk away. I carry more than just car keys now. I don't care if I'm being paranoid. That experience opened my eyes. I think a lot of people underestimate how vulnerable housekeepers can be in hotels. We go into rooms alone. We're isolated from the front desk. Guests don't always check out when they say they do. Sometimes we knock and get no answer, only to find someone still in bed. Now I realize how easily something could happen and no one would know. I try not to let that day control me, but it left a mark. I haven't felt completely safe at work since. That man didn't physically hurt me, but he got in my head. And that's sometimes worse, because it lingers. You start to question everything, every face, every voice, every comment. You start to realize how quickly a normal day can turn into the kind of story people don't believe until it happens to them. Story 3. I've been working at an independent hotel for just over 4 years now. We're the #1 rated hotel in our city, and we take a lot of pride in that. I mostly work in housekeeping, but I've spent time at the front desk too. I love my job. My bosses are great, and I've always felt safe. Until recently. Being a housekeeper, I've seen a lot of strange things. People sneak in pets all the time. Dogs, cats, even once a chicken. We don't allow any animals, but people get creative. Once I was cleaning a stayover room and saw tripods set up around the bed, professional camera gear everywhere. That was awkward. Another time we had to call the cops because we found meth in a room. They raided it and found a lot of drugs and guns. But today was the first time I've actually been afraid to be in a guest's room. The man staying in room 208 had checked in for several days. He caught me at my supply cart and told me, "You can go ahead and clean my room now. I'm heading down for breakfast." I was glad. Stayovers are easier to clean early in the day, and it helps laundry get started sooner. I popped into his room, left the door propped open like we always do, and immediately noticed something strange. About 20 prescription bottles lined up on one of the beds, along with insulin and needles. I'm nosy, I'll admit. I looked closer. Oddly enough, it was only 2 kinds of medication, some for diabetes and the rest for cholesterol. But it was the quantity that weirded me out. Why would someone have so many bottles of the same 2 prescriptions? I brushed it off and started making the bed, but there were stains on the bedding. That meant I had to change everything instead of just turning down the sheets. I sighed, left the room to grab fresh linens, and came right back. As I set the clean linens on the chair, something caught my eye. 2 pieces of paper sitting on the armoire under the TV. I wasn't going to look at them, but the word "kill" was scrawled across one of them. That stopped me cold. I dropped the linens and walked over to read the note. He said, "You don't have to forgive her. You just can't kill her. You are here to take money and alcohol away from you. Get over having to kill her and you can safely leave." I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. The second note looked like a to-do list at first, just random words, but it made my stomach turn. Spray and wash, apply for Medicare, insubordination. The soul is healed by being with children. Bank card follow-up, inheritance, savings. Cowie Pop 10, map Montana. There will be a day of reckoning. Did you tell Mum what I said? How did Beth get my address? It was all so disturbing and erratic. I quickly pulled out my phone and snapped photos of the notes. I wasn't going to stay in that room. I left, closed the door behind me, and turned, only to see the man walking back toward his room. He was about 10 feet away. My blood ran cold. Somehow I managed to smile and say, "I need more supplies. I'll be back in your room in a bit." Then I turned and made a beeline for the elevator. I spotted our maintenance guy waiting and whispered to him about what I saw. He could tell I was shaken. It's not like me to act nervous. He rode down with me and I went straight to my boss. I told her that for the first time in 4 years, I wasn't comfortable being in a guest's room. I showed her the photos. Her face went pale. She took the phone and walked straight to the general manager. They huddled in the back office. Minutes later, the GM took the maintenance man with her and went up to the guest's room. They told him he had 1 hour to pack up and leave. He was no longer welcome at the hotel. I sat in the laundry room, trying to calm my nerves. My boss came back and stayed upstairs with me until the man left for good. I don't know who Beth was. I don't know what woman he was trying to convince himself not to kill, but the tone of those notes, the way they were written, it didn't feel like empty venting. It felt like a plan that was unraveling. The scariest part? There were no laws broken. He hadn't done anything, technically. But everything in those notes made me think someone, maybe not me, was in danger. I'm just glad I trusted my gut and left when I did. I keep thinking, what if I hadn't looked at the notes? What if he'd come back earlier? I could have been trapped in that room with him. It reminded me how vulnerable hotel staff really are. We go into rooms alone, with no way of knowing what kind of person is on the other side of that door. Most of the time it's just a mess to clean, maybe a weird smell, maybe some rude comments. But sometimes it's something more. I've worked there for years, I've seen some wild things. But this is the first time I truly felt like I might not walk out of a room. I don't know what he was planning, but I know I wasn't going to be a part of it. Story 4. I'm a female from northern Norway. When I was younger, I used to do speed skating, ice skating, where you train to be as fast as possible. I had 2 coaches, both fairly old, and we would travel to different locations for competitions. I had been skating for about a year when we traveled to this remote peninsula for an event. It was in the middle of nowhere, a little town of about 2,000 people with 1 hotel. It took us 5 hours to drive there from my hometown. When we arrived, we settled into the hotel. For some reason, the coaches booked 2 rooms, one for themselves and one for me. All the other skaters who used to train with me had either quit or weren't allowed to travel, so I was alone in my room. At first, it felt great. I had privacy, a break from the routine, and time to relax before competing. While waiting for my turn at the competition, I made friends with a girl about my age. Let's call her Marie. She was kind, sweet, and made the trip a lot more enjoyable. We hung out later that day at her school, where there was some kind of event. Eventually, I invited her to the hotel to hang out. We watched a movie, had some snacks, and talked. It was a great time. When it got late, around midnight, Marie left. I was a decent kid, so I walked her downstairs to say goodbye. While I was there, I decided to buy a soda from the counter near the hotel entrance. A man was standing behind the counter. He had an accent, so I figured he had recently moved to Norway from another country. He seemed overly interested in me, asking what I was doing downstairs at such a late hour. I told him I just wanted a soda and asked for the price, since there wasn't one listed. He said it was 40 Norwegian kroner, about $5. That seemed overpriced. So I said never mind and told him I'd head back upstairs. That's when things got weird. He started begging me to stay and talk to him. It wasn't aggressive at first, but it felt off. He asked my name, where I was from, whether I was there with my parents, and who I was traveling with. I answered honestly, even though something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want to be rude. I've always had this tendency to be nice to people, even when I shouldn't. I eventually told him I was tired and was going to bed. He kept trying to get me to stay longer, but I politely left. Back in my room, I got ready to sleep. I had just gotten under the covers when I heard a knock at the door. At first, I figured it was one of my coaches. Maybe they needed something. I got up and opened the door. It wasn't either of them. It was the man from the counter. He was holding a lighter and, in broken Norwegian, said he was looking for someone who had lost it. I told him it wasn't mine and started to close the door, but he quickly put his foot in the doorway. He asked if he could come in. Fear rushed through me. I pushed on the door with all the strength I had. I can't remember exactly how I did it, but somehow I managed to close and lock it. My heart was pounding. I was terrified. I immediately called my mum, who then called my coaches and told them what had happened. They came to my room right away, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. We never saw him again. When we got home, my mum called the hotel manager to report the incident. She explained everything and demanded they take action. But the manager brushed it off, saying they wouldn't punish the man or fire him no consequences. Even after she explained how serious the situation was and what his intentions might have been, they still did nothing. To this day, I believe he still works there. I still think about that night. I try to understand why I let it get that far, why I answered his questions, why I didn't shut the door sooner, but I was young, polite, and used to trusting people. That night changed how I see the world. I never thought something like that could happen in such a small town, in such a quiet country. But it did, and I'll never forget it. Story 5. I've had my fair share of creepy encounters with men, but this one genuinely scared the life out of me. It was the first time I truly felt like my life was in danger. My husband and I had to drive 17 hours last week to North Carolina for a wedding. The whole trip was exhausting. We spent most of the time rushing from one family gathering to another, barely getting a moment to relax. We were staying in a motel for the duration of our visit. By the time the day of the actual wedding rolled around, we had already been at the motel for a few days. That morning was especially hectic. We were scrambling to get ready for the venue. My husband got dressed before me and left to run some last-minute errands, which meant I was alone in the room, getting ready. It was brutally hot outside and I didn't want to sweat through my dress, so I decided to do my hair and makeup in just my underwear. The motel room was laid out in a way that the mirror and sink were in the open part of the room, separate from the bathroom, meaning anyone outside the window could potentially see me. I had the curtains closed, but they were thin, just sheer enough that a shadow or silhouette might be visible. I was curling my hair when I noticed the shadow of a man walking by the window. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured it was my husband checking to see if I was ready. But then the shadow stopped. No, he didn't just pause, he stayed there. I could see his head bobbing around like he was trying to peer through the thin curtains to get a look inside. That's when I knew it wasn't my husband. A wave of unease hit me. Before I could react, the man reached for the door handle, and to my horror, the door opened. My husband hadn't pulled the door all the way shut before leaving, so it hadn't latched, and now this stranger, this man I didn't know, was standing inside our motel room. I was frozen, still in my underwear, holding a curling iron in one hand and watching this man enter the room like he belonged there. He was tall, at least 6 feet, and his expression was something I'll never forget. He stared at me like he was starving. Then he smiled. Not a normal smile, a wide, twisted grin that made my skin crawl. He began to mumble under his breath. I couldn't catch all the words, but I heard, "Pretty lady," and "come here." Something inside me snapped. I didn't even think. I charged toward him, yelling at the top of my lungs, "Get out of here!" I swung the hot curling iron in his direction, ready to burn his face if I had to. The sudden movement must have startled him, because he backed out of the room quickly and stepped onto the balcony. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I slammed the door shut and locked it, this time all the way, using the bolt and the latch. Then I collapsed onto the floor, shaking. Tears were running down my face. I was too terrified to move. I stayed there frozen until my husband returned about 15 minutes later. When I told him what had happened, he completely freaked out. He wanted to find the guy and beat the hell out of him, but I begged him not to leave me alone. I couldn't handle it. We went to the motel's front desk and told them everything. They called the police. When the officers arrived, I gave them a detailed description of the man. They went around asking other guests if they recognized him, but no one did. They concluded that he wasn't staying there. He had just walked in off the street. We were supposed to stay another day, but we didn't. We went to the wedding, but our minds weren't in it. We skipped most of the reception, went back to the motel, packed our bags, and left. The whole trip had been ruined. I'm usually very careful about locking doors, especially when I'm alone, but this time I hadn't checked after my husband left. And that's all it took. Just one mistake. One unlocked door, and a predator walked right in. I keep replaying that moment in my head. What if I hadn't noticed him? What if I'd been asleep? What if I hadn't had something in my hand to defend myself? It's terrifying how close I came to something much worse. Story 6. This happened about 2.5 years ago. It was October, almost Halloween. My husband and I were out seeing one of our favorite bands with another couple in a big, well-known city. We were completely wasted, drinking screwdrivers and shots of Jack Fire. At some point during the show, our friend went to refill our drinks. When he came back, he had a girl with him who looked to be around our age. In reality, she could have been anywhere from 18 to 28. He told us she had lost her dad and asked if we could help her find him. We were so drunk and caught up in the music that we told her we couldn't really help, but she could hang out with us until she found him. Or he found her. No big deal. She stood with me the entire time. We held on to each other while dancing and sang along to every song. It was actually a great time. For a little while she felt like a fun new friend. But a couple of songs later everything changed. She started begging me to come back to her hotel room with her and her dad. She kept repeating that it wasn't going to be weird, it wouldn't be creepy. She swore they weren't the cops. She just wouldn't stop. Over and over she insisted, saying she just wanted me to come with her. I can't remember everything she said, because like I mentioned, I was heavily inebriated. But I'll never forget the feeling I got. The weird, eerie sensation that something was seriously wrong. Her desperation was unsettling, not playful. It was like she was trying too hard to seem casual, to downplay something that was obviously strange. My husband wasn't paying much attention. He didn't really hear what she was saying, but then out of nowhere, our other friend, the wife of the guy who had brought this girl over, turned around and started cussing her out. I don't remember the exact words, but it was something along the lines of, "You need to back off or get the hell out of here." That's when it hit me. I turned to my husband and said, "This girl is creeping me out. Let's lose her." And we ran, literally ran, out to the lobby to get away. I remember looking over my shoulder as we moved through the crowd, terrified that she was going to follow us. That night stuck with me in a way I couldn't shake. I kept wondering what she really wanted. It wasn't just that she liked me and wanted to hang out more. Something about it felt predatory, manipulative. What made it worse was how she kept bringing up her dad. She wanted me to come back to their hotel room, together. That detail made my skin crawl. Why would you be so adamant about bringing a random drunk girl back to a room you share with your father? Even now, I wonder if they were involved in something much darker, human trafficking, a cult, or something else sinister. There was a vibe to her that was hard to describe, but unmistakable, like she wasn't really in control of her own actions, or like she had rehearsed her lines too many times. The fact that I was so drunk and still had my instincts screaming at me tells me everything I need to know. That wasn't just a random person being overly friendly. That was a setup. And I'll never forget how close I might have come to walking into something I would never walk out of. Story 7. I'm a hunter. I like to hunt wild boar specifically, though I've been deer hunting and have even gotten a turkey for Thanksgiving before. But mostly I stick to boar. For those who don't know, wild boar are a big problem in the southern United States. They reproduce quickly, up to 2 litters a year, and each litter can have 10 or more piglets. Since pigs will eat practically anything, the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with very few restrictions. In my state, hunting large mammals at night or using thermal scopes is usually illegal unless it's for boar or coyotes. I had been saving up for a year, putting aside fun money, trying to justify to my wife why I needed a scope that cost twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on. Eventually I bought it. I took it to the range, sighted it in, and was excited to try it out in the field. There was a location I'd been tracking, one with lots of activity and an open clearing, perfect for glassing and visibility. It was easily accessible by truck, and I'd scoped out several solid vantage points in the days before. I set out around 10 p.m. and parked where I could overlook the clearing. For the first few hours, it was uneventful. I spent most of the time fiddling with the scope, trying out its various thermal settings. I spotted a few deer but they were out of season and my setup wasn't legal for them anyway. Around 2 a.m., I decided to move to another location I had scouted earlier. Maybe it would give me a better view, or at least kill the boredom. The second location wasn't far, but once I got there, something felt off. There were no animals, no owls, no rabbits, nothing. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the deer I had seen earlier were now long gone. I started to get that uneasy feeling that comes when nature suddenly goes silent. That's when I heard it. A crunch, like a branch snapping underfoot. It came from the direction I had just walked in from. I panned the scope over, expecting maybe a deer or a coyote. But what I saw wasn't that. It looked like a small bear at first. Low to the ground, hunched, with an odd gait. But as I adjusted the zoom, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a bear. It was a man. He was completely naked. No shoes, no clothing of any kind. He was crouched low, moving on all fours, almost twitching like an animal. He was sniffing around, palming at tree bark, moving erratically. At one point he stopped, right near the very tree I had been leaning against earlier in the night. That chilled me. But could he smell me? Then he did something I'll never forget. He squatted down with his hands in the dirt between his feet and tilted his head back, like a dog mid-howl. That's when I heard it. A voice, a female voice, coming from his direction. "Help!" it called out. "I'm lost!" I froze. Neither of us moved. I kept my crosshairs centered just in front of him. I didn't want to aim directly at another person, but my instincts were on high alert. Then the voice came again. "Please," it said. "I can't walk." It was his voice. There was no one else there. He had mimicked a woman's voice so perfectly I almost believed it myself. But I had seen him walking on all fours with my own eyes. He could walk just fine. That's when I knew it was a trap. I had already packed up most of my gear out of boredom earlier, so I didn't have much to gather. But when I looked back through the scope, he had changed. He was no longer squatting, he was standing tall, now fully upright, and staring directly in my direction. I swear to God he was smiling. I yelled out, "Fuck off!" trying to sound braver than I felt. He took a step toward me, then another. I fired a round high above his head into the tree line. He stopped, hunched back down and started crawling again, eyes just above the grass like a predator. I aimed directly at him this time and shouted, "The next one will mess you up, go away!" My voice cracked. I was shaking. He stayed still, just watching me. It felt like forever, though it was probably only a minute or two. Then suddenly he bolted, ran at full speed into the tree line opposite the road. I tried to track him through the scope, but he moved fast. Too fast. I fired another round into the trees and racked another shell, but dropped the spare mag in my panic. I didn't care. I grabbed my remaining gear and sprinted to my truck. I threw everything in the cab, kept my rifle in the passenger seat, and peeled out of there. I could still hear him in the distance, making a noise I couldn't describe. Something between laughter and crying. I reported it to Fish and Game, but they just scolded me for hunting alone at night. No follow-up, no explanation. For a long time, I told people I had run into a deranged man living off the land. But then, one night, around a campfire, I shared the story with my nephew. His face went pale. He told me about skinwalkers, Wendigos, rakes. He said the forest where we were camping was technically the same one where I saw that thing just 50 miles away. He got so scared that his mum had to take him home. She was furious. I'm not saying what I saw was definitely something supernatural. I'm just saying, if creatures like that exist, I may have gotten closer to one than I ever wanted. Story 8. To help paint the picture, I was 26 years old at the time, 5'5", with medium-length bleach blonde hair, curvy, about 175 pounds. I was wearing black high-waisted tights and a pink crop top. 3 years ago, I was walking home late at night from my friend's house. It was dark, and I lived in a rough part of a large city. I'd had plenty of sketchy situations in the past, so I guess I felt kind of invincible, like nothing truly bad could happen to me. I always stayed alert and aware of my surroundings when walking alone. It was just a habit for my own safety. I was about halfway home, maybe 10 minutes from my apartment, when I noticed a van trailing me. I wasn't overly alarmed. Where I lived, it was unfortunately common for a young woman walking alone to get propositioned. It's embarrassing to admit how desensitized I was to this. Sometimes it didn't matter what I wore. I could be in a revealing outfit or a full winter coat zipped up to my neck, and it would still happen. As expected, the van pulled up next to me. I glanced over and saw two men in the front seats. They looked like they might be brothers. Dark hair, dark eyes, similar facial features. I kept walking and crossed the road, thinking they'd take the hint, but they didn't. Instead, they turned down a side street, then looped around and came back onto my road, following me again. Each time I crossed the street, they circled back. It became obvious this wasn't just someone being annoying. They were persistent. That's when I started to feel unsafe. After a few minutes of this cat and mouse game, they sped ahead and disappeared for a while. I thought maybe they'd given up. I even started pulling out my phone to call my sister, who I lived with, just to have someone on the line. And that's when they struck. The van suddenly pulled up right next to me, faster this time. One of the men jumped out, threw open the back door and came straight toward me. His movement was fast, aggressive, like he was ready to grab me and shove me into the van. The street was quiet at that moment. It's a busy area, but traffic is unpredictable. I realized they must have been waiting for a lull, a window where no one was around. As he approached, I did the only thing I could think of. I held my phone up toward him and said loudly, "You're being filmed on live video chat. My friends have your license plate. The police have been notified." I said it with as much calm as I could, even though my insides were shaking. I didn't know if he would believe me, but he paused. I tilted the phone a bit more, as if to show this imaginary audience a clearer view of his face. He stared at me for a second, weighing his options. Then he jumped back into the van and they sped off. I stood there in the middle of the sidewalk, stunned. My hands were shaking. My heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest. Somehow, I'd bluffed my way out of a kidnapping attempt. I've never been the same since that night. I'm scared to walk alone now, even in broad daylight. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't thought fast, if I'd frozen, if they'd called my bluff. I don't know who those two men were, where they came from, but they were watching me. They chose that exact moment to strike. That means they'd probably been watching for a while. To the two creeps in the van, I hope karma finds you soon. Story 9. When I was 15 years old, I was babysitting my little cousins while my aunt and uncle went out for a dinner party. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with long streets, street lamps and perfectly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. The kids had been fed and were already in their pajamas when I arrived. We watched a movie and I got them tucked into bed just after 9 p.m. After they were asleep, I stayed downstairs in the living room, scrolling through my phone and texting my boyfriend at the time. Everything was quiet, peaceful even. Around 10:30, I heard what sounded like a knock on the back sliding glass door. It was faint, barely audible, but I heard it again about 30 seconds later. At first I thought maybe it was the wind or a tree branch brushing against the glass. I went into the kitchen and peeked out the back window, which overlooked the small backyard. There was a man standing there. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up and jeans. He was facing the door, but standing completely still, like a statue. My heart jumped into my throat. I didn't know what to do. I backed away slowly and grabbed my phone. I texted my uncle right away. "There's a man in the backyard." He didn't respond immediately. I didn't want to call the police without knowing if maybe it was someone they knew, maybe a neighbor or a friend. I kept glancing out the window, and the man didn't move. He was just standing there. After a minute or so, I heard footsteps on the side of the house. I crept over to the front window and looked out. just in time to see another man walking up the driveway. He stopped near the front door, looked around, and then crouched down behind the bushes. That's when I realized they were working together. I ran upstairs, locked the bedroom doors, and grabbed the house phone. I called 911 and explained what was happening. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me and told me to stay in the room with the door locked. She said officers were on their way. Then I heard the sliding door open. It had been locked, but I guess they found a way to force it. I heard footsteps coming into the house, slow and deliberate. My hands were shaking as I whispered into the phone that they were inside. I grabbed the kids from their beds and moved them into the closet with me, trying to keep them quiet and calm. We stayed hidden for what felt like an eternity. The footsteps moved through the living room, then into the kitchen. I heard drawers opening and closing like they were looking for something. Then I heard one of them say, "Check upstairs." I almost dropped the phone. Just then we heard loud knocking at the front door, followed by shouting, "Police! Open up!" There was a crash and the sound of people running. The men bolted out the back door, and a few seconds later officers were in the house. They searched every room and made sure we were okay. I came out of the closet with the kids, all of us in tears. Later, they told me the two men had likely been casing the house, assuming no one was home. The porch lights had been off and the curtains were drawn. They probably didn't expect a babysitter to be there. Nothing was stolen. It seemed like they hadn't gotten far enough before the police arrived. But the thought that they had made it inside, while I was there, while the kids were asleep, still makes me sick to my stomach. After that night, I never babysat again. I still have trouble sleeping in unfamiliar houses, especially when I hear creaks or distant sounds. I keep a bat by my bed now, even though it's been years. That kind of fear never really goes away. Story 10. About 10 years ago when I was in college, I worked part-time delivering pizzas. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and I could work around my class schedule. I usually worked the late shift on Fridays and Saturdays, typically from 5 p.m. to 2 a.m. It got busy, especially after 11 p.m. when the bars closed and drunk people wanted food. One night around 1:30 a.m. I got an order for a delivery just outside town. It wasn't too far, but it was in a rural area, long roads, no streetlights, and houses spaced far apart. I didn't think anything of it. I'd done deliveries out that way plenty of times before. The address was a small single-story house at the end of a gravel driveway. When I pulled up, the porch light was off, but the rest of the house seemed to have lights on inside. I got out, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the front door. I rang the bell and waited. No answer. I knocked. Still nothing. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the order. A man answered. His voice was strange, raspy, and slow. He said, "Yeah, I'm here. Door's open. Just bring it inside." That set off a red flag for me. We weren't supposed to go into customers' homes. Company policy was very clear. Leave the pizza at the door and wait for them to come out. I told him, "Sorry, I can't come inside. You'll have to come to the door." There was a pause. Then he said, "I'm not feeling good. Just come in. It's fine." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I repeated myself, "I can't do that, man. Company rules." He sighed heavily, and then the line went dead. I knocked again, louder this time. Still no answer. I stood there for another minute before turning around and heading back to my car. As I was walking away, I glanced back at the house and saw someone peeking through the blinds. I froze. The face in the window didn't move, it just stared at me. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a person, eyes locked on me. I got in my car and drove away, fast. Back at the store, I told my manager what happened. He called the number himself, and this time no one answered. We marked the order as undeliverable and moved on. About a week later, the police showed up at the pizza shop. They asked me and my manager about the delivery to that house. I told them everything. How the guy wanted me to come inside, how I refused, how I saw someone watching me through the window. That's when they told us what they had found. Apparently a neighbor had called in a welfare check because the house was supposed to be vacant. The owners had moved out months earlier. and no one was supposed to be living there. When the police entered the home, they found a mattress on the floor, some empty food containers, and a bunch of old pizza boxes. There was also a large kitchen knife under the mattress, and a camcorder pointing toward the front door. It was like someone had been squatting there, waiting for someone to come in. Waiting for me. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm certain that if I had stepped inside that house, I wouldn't be here telling this story. Story 11. I was about 11 or 12 years old when this happened. My older sister was in high school, and she used to babysit me when our parents worked late. It was a winter night, and we were home alone. Our house was in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other and nothing ever really happened. We were watching TV in the living room, wrapped in blankets, just hanging out. It had started snowing earlier in the evening, so everything outside looked peaceful and still. Around 8:30 p.m. we heard the doorbell ring. My sister looked at me, confused. We weren't expecting anyone. She got up and went to the door, peeking through the peephole. She immediately tensed up and motioned for me to be quiet. There was a man standing outside. He wasn't wearing a jacket even though it was freezing. He didn't look homeless or anything, just wrong. His expression was blank and he stood too close to the door like he was listening. My sister whispered for me to go upstairs and lock myself in our parents' room. I didn't argue. I ran upstairs and sat on the floor next to the bed, listening. A few moments later I heard the doorbell ring again, then knocking. Slow, deliberate knocks. My sister didn't open the door. She called our parents, but neither of them answered. Then she called 911. I heard her say that a strange man was at the door and wouldn't leave. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line and that an officer was on the way. The knocking stopped. A minute or two passed. Then I heard the sound of the back gate creaking open. We had a fenced-in backyard with a wooden gate that always made noise when it moved. My sister must have heard it too, because she yelled up to me, "Stay in the room! Lock the door!" I did. I heard her moving around downstairs, then silence. I didn't know what was happening. I stayed frozen on the floor, holding my breath. Then I heard a loud bang, like something hitting the back door. It was followed by more banging, like someone was trying to break it down. I heard my sister scream, then the sound of the front door opening. For a second I panicked, thinking she had let him in, but then I heard a man shouting. Another voice. It was the police. I came downstairs after the commotion died down. My sister was crying and an officer was in the house. Apparently the man had gone around the back and tried to force his way in. He had a screwdriver in his hand and had been prying at the door lock. The officer said they caught him in the backyard, hiding behind a tree. He didn't resist when they arrested him, just kept mumbling about how he thought this was the right house. It wasn't. He didn't know us. He had no connection to anyone in the neighborhood. He had no explanation for why he was there, no car, no ID, just a screwdriver and some rope in his coat pocket. If my sister hadn't called the police when she did, I don't like to think about what might have happened. We ended up staying with our aunt for a few nights after that. My parents installed security cameras and new locks. For a long time, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I heard a creak in the house or saw headlights outside the window, I'd freeze. That night changed how I see the world. You never really think something like that can happen to you, until it does. Story 12. This happened to me about 5 years ago when I was living in a small apartment complex just outside the city. I was in my late 20s, working night shifts at a hospital, so I usually got home around 7 a.m. and went straight to bed. The complex was relatively quiet, mostly older residents and working class people like me. Nothing ever really happened there, until one morning in January. I had just gotten home from a long shift, exhausted. I made a cup of tea, took a quick shower and crawled into bed. My bedroom was at the back of the apartment, facing a wooded area that separated our building from a small creek. I had blackout curtains and a white noise machine, so I usually slept like a rock. But not that morning. I was woken up around 10 a.m. by the sound of someone knocking, not on my door, but on the bedroom window. At first I thought I was dreaming. Then it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Silence. I got out of bed and pulled the curtain back just a bit to peek out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There was a man crouched outside my window, but he wasn't doing anything. Just crouching there, looking up at the window like he was waiting for a response. He had a scruffy beard, a grey hoodie, and jeans that were stained with something dark. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. Was he a neighbour? Was he hurt? Was this some kind of prank? Before I could decide what to do, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. Not a huge one, but big enough to scare the hell out of me. He started tapping the blade against the window. I backed away slowly, grabbed my phone, and called the police. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, I heard another knock, this time on my front door. I crept through the apartment, staying low, and peeked out the peephole. No one was there. Then I heard a thump at the back window again. He was moving between the front and back of the apartment, like he was testing entry points. The dispatcher told me to stay inside and not engage. Officers were already on the way. I locked myself in the bathroom, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed on the way, and sat there in silence. I could hear footsteps outside, pacing, sometimes stopping, then starting again. At one point, I heard him whisper something, but I couldn't make out the words. It felt like forever before the knock on the front door came again, this time followed by a voice. Police. I opened the door to 2 officers. They asked if I was okay and told me they had found the man trying to open one of my neighbour's windows. When they approached, he ran into the woods. They chased him, but lost him near the creek. He was never caught. After that, I couldn't sleep in that apartment anymore. I broke my lease early and moved in with a friend across town. I never saw the man again, but I still think about him. How he moved, how he waited, how he never said a word. Just a man with a knife, crouched outside my bedroom window. Story 13. This happened when I was 17 years old. I lived in a small town, one of those places where everybody knows everybody and nothing really bad ever seems to happen. You grow up thinking you're safe because you've walked the same roads your whole life. You recognize every car that passes by, and most people greet each other by name. That's just how it was, and maybe that's why I let my guard down. At the time, I had a part-time job working at a small local diner after school. It wasn't anything special, just a greasy spoon with worn vinyl booths and the kind of regulars who came in like clockwork every morning and evening. I worked 3 or 4 nights a week, mostly clearing tables, refilling coffee and helping out in the back when it got busy. The diner closed at 10 p.m, but with cleaning duties, I usually didn't get out until closer to 10:30. One Friday night, I was closing with just one other co-worker, a guy named Derek. He was maybe 21 or 22, a few years older than me. He'd started working at the diner about a month before. He wasn't particularly friendly, but he wasn't rude either, just quiet, kept to himself. If you asked him something, he'd answer, but never offered more than he had to. I didn't know much about him, but he always seemed polite, at least at first. That night, the 2 of us were finishing up our closing routine. I was wiping down the booths and he was sweeping behind the counter. It was quiet. No music, no customers, just the sound of chairs being stacked and plates clinking in the sink. As I finished my section and clocked out, I grabbed my bag and turned to leave. That's when Derek said, "Hey, I'll walk you to your car. It's dark out and those parking lot lights are still busted." I hesitated. It was true, the lights had been flickering on and off all week and the parking lot could get really dark. Still, something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. Not the words themselves, but the tone. Too casual, like it was something he'd been planning to say all night. But I didn't want to be rude. I smiled and said, "Sure, thanks." We walked out together, but the moment we stepped into the cool night air, I could feel the tension. He didn't walk beside me. He walked a few steps behind. I kept glancing back, hoping he'd catch up and make conversation, but he didn't. He was just silent, watching me. I tried to fill the silence with small talk. "Busy night, huh?" I said. "Nothing." I laughed nervously. "I can't wait to get home and sleep." Still no response. My heart started beating faster, but I kept walking, pretending everything was fine. When I reached my car, I turned around to say goodnight and thank him again, but he was standing way too close, inches from me, just smiling. But not a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you instinctively don't trust, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. It felt rehearsed, almost like he was practicing an expression he thought he was supposed to wear. He said, "You should come hang out with me." I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "There's a spot in the woods," he said, almost too quickly. "It's quiet. No one goes there. We could talk." I laughed awkwardly, trying to play it off. "I don't think so. My mum's waiting for me. I've got homework and—" He interrupted, "It's just a walk. You don't have to be scared." That phrase, the way he said it, that's what hit me hardest. It didn't feel reassuring. It felt like a threat, like he was already preparing for me to be afraid. I felt my stomach twist. My hands were trembling as I fumbled in my purse for my keys. "I really have to go," I said, forcing a smile. "Good night." I opened my car door and slipped inside, locking it as fast as I could. He just stood there staring through the window. Then he lifted his hand and knocked, just once, with one knuckle. Tap. Then he leaned in, his breath fogging up the glass, and mouthed the words. "You don't have to be scared." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just started the engine and drove off. I didn't stop until I was a mile away, and even then I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and sat in my car for a while, hands shaking, trying to calm down. I kept going over everything in my head. The silence, the smile, the woods, the way he moved, the knock. The next morning I went straight to my manager and told her what had happened. She listened quietly, her face unreadable. She said she'd talked to Derek. I don't know if she ever did, but I do know that he never showed up to work again, just vanished. A few months later, I was talking to another co-worker who had heard from someone in a nearby town that Derek had been arrested. According to the rumors, he had picked up a girl. Someone a little younger than me from a different diner, told her the same line about going for a walk in the woods. Only she said yes. She managed to escape before anything could happen, ran barefoot through the trees until she found a road and flagged down a passing car. The police got involved and he was caught soon after. I never found out exactly what he planned to do or how far he'd gone, but that was enough for me. For a long time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly awful. All he needed was a yes. One word. That's all it would have taken for the story to have ended very differently. And I've never said yes to a walk in the woods since.